Welcome to Resonate. Family, there are times when following God will leave you with one question. Why? Not because you don't believe or you're trying to be difficult, but because what He's asking you to do doesn't seem to connect to anything. One day, God told me to take pictures of a couple of license plates at our community pool. I did it, but you know what? I was thinking, why? Because nothing was happening and there wasn't a reason that I could see at the time. Well, weeks went by, months went by, and I forgot all about the pictures. And then one day I had to go to court. The judge looked at me and asked, what were the cars in their license plate at the pool? And in that moment, something that made no sense months earlier suddenly made sense. You know, that taught me something about God. God won't always ask you to do things that make sense. And if we're being honest, that's where many of us struggle. We usually don't have a problem obeying God after we know the outcome. We struggle when God gives us instructions without telling us what He's doing. Think about Hosea hearing God say, I want you to marry Gomer, not just any woman, a prostitute. If you were Hosea, wouldn't your first question be, God, why would a holy God ask his prophet to do something like that? How do you explain that to your family and friends? How do you explain anything you don't even understand yourself? But notice this. Before God explained the purpose, he gave the instructions. Hosea had to decide whether he was going to trust God's wisdom or his own. Later God revealed why. Hosea's marriage became a real life picture of God's relationship with Israel. Israel kept turning away from God, but God continued reaching for them. What looked confusing at the beginning started to become clear later on. Now, don't miss this. I'm not saying every instruction from God will make sense later the way my story did. I'm saying God isn't limited by what makes sense to us. His view is different because he sees what we can't. In Isaiah, it says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That's why there are moments when God asks you to do something that doesn't fit your reasoning, because he's working with information you don't have. Maybe he's dealing with you about something in your life that has no business being there. Maybe he's dealing with you about taking a step you've been putting off because you keep saying it doesn't make sense. All right, be careful because sometimes we're so busy asking God for an explanation that we never obey him. Now, let me say this. I'm not talking about acting on every thought that enters your mind. If you believe God is leading you, it should agree with his word. God will never tell you to do something that will contradict him. And don't reject what God is saying simply because you don't understand it yet. When I took those pictures, I had no idea I had to go to court months later. If I had waited until it made sense, I would have never taken them. And when it was time for court, I wouldn't have had what was needed. God was preparing me way before I knew why. Maybe that's where you are today. You've been waiting for God to explain everything before you take the next step. Sometimes the explanation won't be first, the obedience will. If you feel like this has resonated with you, let me know in the comments and share it with someone. And until next time, keep your head up, your hands up, and let it resonate.